And now, Tammany Hall and the Dorr Rebellion by Arthur May Mowry. Since the adoption of the Constitution of the United States, no civil or political conflict has arisen in any state more interesting to the historian of American life or more instructive to the student of political and constitutional matters than the so-called Dorr Rebellion in Rhode Island. The 6 weeks of armed controversy during the months of May and June 1842 were but an incident in the 3-year struggle for a more popular government in the little Commonwealth, and the agitation of the years 1841 to 1843 was but one step, though the most important, in the change from the oligarchy of 1775 to the democracy of 1888. The Dorr Rebellion was not an isolated fact. An understanding of its meaning and importance can be obtained only by a thorough study of the political and constitutional history of the colony and the state from the reception of the Charter of 1663 until the adoption of the suffrage amendment to the Constitution in 1888. The issue underlying this whole struggle was the general right of the people to adopt the new Constitution. In the words of the Rhode Island Suffrage Association, the position held by the advocates of a change in the form of government was that whenever a majority of the citizens of this state, who are recognized as citizens of the United States, shall by their delegates in convention assembled draft a constitution, and the same shall be accepted by their constituents, it will be, to all intents and purposes, the law of the state. In other words, they declared that a majority of the governed have at any time, and on any occasion, a right to change their government, a right which, being inherent, unalienable, and indefeasible, not even they can part with by their free and voluntary act. In the course of the struggle between the People's Party and the Law and Order men, or the Algerines as they were called, by their opponents, several other issues presented themselves. When the rival state governments appealed to the President of the United States to bring the national government and the federal army into the contest, the constitutional issue was raised as to the authority of the national executive as an arbitrator in such crises in the commonwealths. The right of the national legislature and that of the federal judiciary to decide between the two conflicting governments were most thoroughly discussed in connection with this controversy. It is evident that, though the contest was local, the questions presented were national in importance. Several other issues came into view before the contest was ended. The refusal of certain state governors to honor the requisition of the de facto governor of Rhode Island to hold in arrest the fugitive leader of the defeated party added a complication to the situation. The declaration of martial law by the Law and Order governor, under power voted him by the Charter, General Assembly, led to the decision of the Supreme Court of the state of Rhode Island and to the individual opinion of Justice Woodbury of the United States Supreme Court in the famous Luther Borden case. Again, when the contest had subsided, the trial of the leader of the insurrection gave rise to the novel plea that there could be no treason against a single state, inasmuch as the Constitution of the United States defined treason against the United States only. Further, the natural conflict between legislature and judiciary was emphasized by the action taken by the Rhode Island General Assembly several years afterwards in ordering that the records of the trial for treason and the conviction of Governor Dorr be obliterated from the records of the state. Not the least interesting among the constitutional, political, legal, and social issues which the Dorr Rebellion produced were the various attempts made in other states to interfere in the Rhode Island controversy. The cause of liberty, so dear to the American people, would not permit them to let this contest pass by without expressions of sympathy at least. From Maine to Louisiana, the newspapers freely expressed themselves in favor either of the People's Party or of the Law and Order government. Within the state of Rhode Island, national politics did not enter into the controversy, as leading Democrats joined with the Whigs in establishing the charter government in 1842. Elsewhere, the newspapers and the people in general were influenced almost without exception by their party predilections as they took sides on the issue. In Boston, the Democratic Post was very earnest in its support of the People's Party and the Dorr government. It was the first newspaper outside of Rhode Island to call attention to the struggle in the neighboring state, and from the beginning of January 1842 until long after the People's government had entirely collapsed, the Post continued to praise the suffragists and to heap obloquy upon the Algerines and every opponent of the popular movement. On the other hand, the Boston Atlas, true to its Whig principles, found the democracy hidden behind Dorr and his party and vehemently upheld the charter government. As early as April 20th, 1842, it said editorially, "The Rhode Island Locofoco Revolution turns out, as we presumed it would, to have been a bloodless one." In New York, also, the newspapers divided along the party lines. The Evening Post, assisted by the New Era, notorious under the editorship of Levi Slam, was insistent in season and out of season that the rights of the people and of Governor Dorr in particular should be protected. The Courier and Inquirer and the American enthusiastically supported Governor King and bitterly commented upon every act of the revolutionists. No less certain of its position was the Washington National Intelligencer, which daily informed its readers of the situation in Rhode Island and animadverted of all who opposed the legitimate government in the little Commonwealth. Interest in the controversy extended even farther than the national capital. The Richmond Inquirer advised the federal government to keep its hands off. "Move not a soldier, send not a musket into Rhode Island." The New Orleans Commercial Bulletin took a different view and demanded interference. The posture of affairs in Rhode Island is truly deplorable, and if suffered to proceed much farther, will do more to impair American credit and character abroad than any event since the date of our government. Naturally, the people were not far behind the newspapers in giving expressions to their sentiments. The strength of the law and order government was soon perceived, however, and the weakness of the People's Party prevented the necessity of any special movement in opposition to it. Mass meetings were held in various cities, Philadelphia and Boston in particular, to express sympathy for the oppressed people of Rhode Island. New York took the lead in advising the use of arms, in establishing the people's government, and in resisting the government de facto, even though the latter be aided by the federal authorities. About the middle of April 1842, the Evening Post called attention to a proposed memorial which was in circulation in the city of New York, calling on the House of Representatives to impeach President Tyler for his armed interference or threatened coercive measures against the people of Rhode Island in their struggle to cast off the authority claimed over them under King Charles II's charter. This memorial was never presented, but a meeting of sympathy was held in Tammany Hall on the evening of April 27th. Aaron Vanderpoel was chosen president for the occasion, and A.W. Parmenter of Rhode Island presented the cause of the suffragists. Though not numerously attended, this gathering prepared the way for later meetings when the inherent weakness of the Dorr movement was more clearly perceived. The inauguration of Governor Dorr, May 3, 1842, was quickly followed by a hasty trip to Washington. Here, Dorr met President Tyler, Mr. Webster, Secretary of State, and other leaders of the great political parties, but he failed to obtain sympathy for himself or his party sufficient to encourage him to proceed farther in the attempt to establish his government. Had Governor Dorr passed directly through New York on his return from Washington to Providence, the sequel of events in Rhode Island would have been materially altered. The testimony at hand seems to justify the conclusion that the Civil War, which broke out on May 17th, would have been entirely averted. Governor Dorr had learned in Washington that he not only could hope for no help from the national executive, but must also expect to find the federal troops assisting the de facto government. He had, however, found the president anxious to avert civil strife and ready to use his influence to obtain an act of indemnity for the entire people's government. It was evident even to the enthusiastic suffrage leader that he could not cope with the national government, even if his party, which he thought to be a numerical majority of the people of Rhode Island, might perhaps successfully resist the charter government. On his arrival at the metropolis, therefore, he had determined, though very reluctantly, to leave the government de facto in peace and to trust to the good offices of President Tyler to effect a compromise. Governor Dorr was very cordially received on his arrival in New York. One of his fellow commissioners, Burrington Anthony, had returned at once to Rhode Island, ready to carry what comfort he could to his friends at home. The third commissioner, Duty J. Pierce, who has been called Dorr's right-hand man, remained with his leader. The two Rhode Islanders were invited to attend the Bowery Theater that evening by certain prominent Tammany leaders. The fact of the acceptance of this invitation by the two distinguished visitors was duly announced in the daily press, and was even supposed to have increased the size of the audience. Most notable among the distinguished Tammany men escorting the governor was the Honorable E.F. Purdy, ex-president of the New York Board of Aldermen. This act of courtesy was but the beginning of the attentions which were bestowed upon the people's governor. The time spent in the metropolis was very short, being scarcely more than one day, but every one of the governor's waking hours was monopolized by his new friends. Saturday forenoon, Tammany Hall accorded a reception to the governor and to welcome B. Sales, the Speaker of the People's General Assembly. Several hours were spent by these two suffrage leaders in talking over the condition of affairs in Rhode Island, and the counsel which Tammany Hall gave to the People's Party is evident from the sequel which came less than 4 days later, the famous attack on the Arsenal. When the time came for the governor to resume his journey to Providence, he found that a crowd had collected in the park, desirous of obtaining a glimpse of the distinguished stranger. Immediately, a procession was formed as an escort under the head of William H. Cornell. Besides the 500 people who marched in citizens' dress, the services of a band were obtained, and also a company of volunteer firemen. Governor Dorr and Speaker Sales were accompanied in their barouche by ex-alderman Purdy and Slam, the editor. The open sympathy thus shown the disheartened governor was accentuated by a communication which he received before leaving the city. New York, May 13, 1842. To Thomas W. Dorr, Governor of the State of Rhode Island, Sir, several military companies of the city and vicinity having tendered their services to form a military escort to accompany you to Providence, we have the honor to apprise your excellency of the fact. This distinction, which they so much admire, we hope will meet with your cheerful acceptance. With sentiments of the highest respect, we are very respectfully yours, Alexander Wing, Jr., Colonel, 13th Regiment, NYA. Abraham J. Crasto, Lieutenant Colonel, 236th Regiment, NYSI. In reply, Governor Dorr wrote as follows: New York, May 14, 1842. To Colonels Wing and Crasto, gentlemen, I return to you my most sincere thanks for the offer contained in your letter of yesterday of an escort of several military companies to accompany me to the city of Providence. It is impossible to mistake the spirit in which this offer is made. It is an indication of the fraternal interest with which you regard the present struggle for their just rights of the people of Rhode Island, whom I have the honor to represent. While I should not feel justified at the present moment in withdrawing you from your homes and business on the expedition contemplated, allow me to say that the time may not be far distant when I may be obliged to call upon you for your services in that cause to which you will so promptly render the most efficient aid, the cause of American citizens contending for their sovereign right to make and maintain a republican constitution and opposed by the hired soldiers of the general government. In this unequal contest, I invoke your aid and that of your associates in arms. We appeal from the government to the people and rely upon them in the last resort to defend our rights from every arbitrary aggression. Be pleased to make my cordial acknowledgments to officers and privates who have kindly united with you in the honor which has been proffered me, and accept the regards of your friend and fellow citizen, Thomas W. Dorr. During the time that Governor Dorr had been absent from the state, the people's government had practically ceased to exist. The executive officers had failed to obtain possession of any of the state papers and documents, and accordingly were unable to perform any executive functions. The legislature had adjourned after a single-day session, and many of its members had publicly announced their resignations and their determination no longer to uphold the people's government. The judiciary did not exist, inasmuch as the legislature during its short session had failed to choose judges. Many of the prominent leaders of the suffragists were under arrest, and the favor of the federal authorities was evidently with the charter government. A few men only stood firmly for Governor Dorr and the people's government. On his return to Providence, Burrington Anthony addressed an open-air meeting, which was held in front of the State House. The delegate presented a highly colored account of the results of his flying trip to Washington, and a series of resolutions was passed denouncing all compromises, pledging resistance to all efforts of the charter government to arrest the leaders of the People's Party, and promising to protect and defend Governor Dorr to the end. Such was the situation in Providence when Dorr arrived in the city at about 10 o'clock Monday forenoon, May 16th. A large crowd of enthusiasts and curiosity seekers greeted him at the station and escorted him to the residence of Mr. Anthony, which the governor wished to use as his headquarters. Before dismissing his escort, Dorr made an address which showed the influence which his New York visit had had upon his plans. A rumor was current in the city that the governor had procured the aid of 500 men from abroad. Dorr denied the truth of this statement, but said that he had been promised the aid of 5,000 men and that he could have them at any time. He was sure of assistance enough from New York to paralyze any force which the United States might use against the suffrage party in Rhode Island. The governor then drew a sword and, holding it out, declared that it had belonged to an officer who had died in Florida and had been presented to him by a brother of this officer, adding that the sword must never be dishonored while in his possession.